Hello, good morning, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. Welcome to the Undivide Project podcast, the Changemakers Edition. And this season, we are focusing on women who are doing the work, whether it's in climate action, environmental justice, social justice, or facing another critical crisis that we have to deal with on this planet. We are highlighting the ones who are at the forefront of solutions. My name is Monica Sanders, and I'm your host, and I'm so excited to be here with Olivia Nielsen. Thank you so much for joining us, Olivia.
Thank you for having me.
So I start every podcast off with asking for the person's origin story. And you can choose whatever origin appeals to you in this moment, but I would love to hear a story from your beginnings.
Well, my origin story, I think, confuses people. I am originally from Paris, France. And yes, I was raised by American parents, bohemian artists in Paris. And now I live in the US, but I've lived in quite a few countries in between the two, including in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. And it was really in Haiti where I grounded myself in my passion to make cities and housing in particular stronger, greener, safer, and just more accessible to everyone, and women in particular. Since Haiti, I've worked in about, 50 countries around the world. And I really specialize in countries that, how to put it, have gone through some difficult times and have very, very nascent housing markets, where the issues are very broad, and there's a lot to be addressed. And so, recently I've been working in countries like Timor-Leste, Djibouti, Papua New Guinea. So countries around the planet, from the South Pacific to Haiti, but you see the same issues come up over and over and over again. So I look forward to discussing it more with you.
That is interesting work. And thank you for sharing that story, because I was going to ask you about your passion for making housing affordable and resilient and green, but also the particular positionality of women, both in being part of the solution, but often being the bearers of the burden of existing housing issues. And then when we're talking about many of these places, every country that you named are among some of the most climate and disaster vulnerable places on the planet, and also have a variety of other kinds of cascading challenges, is the word I'm going to use. But whether we're talking about environment or politics or economics or justice, women tend to bear both the burden of the impacts and the solutions.
That's right. And there's an irony here, which is hard to escape. Women all over the world really are considered homemakers. Women disproportionately work from home. They stay at home longer than men. They live they stay at the house longer than men who go work outside of the house, right? And so whether we like it or not, women are still considered homemakers today. And yet, women are very rarely involved in planning housing projects, in developing housing projects. They have absolutely no say often in how these projects are built, how the houses are built, how the communities are built. It's all designed by men. And it goes one step further, too. In countries around the world, even though women compose about half of the population, they only own a fraction of land titles. And so access to home ownership is very, very low in certain communities where I work. And even though, again, they're the homemakers, they are the ones who spend a disproportionate time at home, they do not own their home. They do not have a say over how their home is designed or how the community is designed. And this has huge impacts on their lives. And this is something that we're really trying to change. And this also has an impact on climate change, because women do want better homes. They do want safer homes. They want homes that are safe for their children to live in, that will withstand the impact of disasters. And I'll give you one example, maybe to start us off. The world is going, and it is already starting, but is going to increasingly experience heat waves. Really, really terrifying heat waves. And women who are at home will have to endure those heat waves, whereas men might be in offices or factories or different places that have the equipment to endure them. So women are they want to ensure that their homes are cool and have a nice airflow inside, right? And so we're seeing some nascent kind of burgeoning projects around the world to, for example, make slums a bit cooler by just some simple things, planting a few trees or painting the roofs white can make a big difference and can decrease the indoor air temperature by a few degrees. And this needs to take place on a much broader scale to make our homes, well, a place where we can actually be safe.
Right. And so I'm interested in how you implement the work, because what you're saying is, women are not landowners or homeowners in many places, and in lots of places, access to ownership also means access to political and policy infrastructures where some of these changes need to take place. But yet, a lot of these projects require women involvement. And so I'm wondering how you navigate these spaces where women are disempowered, but you're actually implementing work with women.
Right. Well, there's many examples. And just as a detail, I work in a much broad scale. I don't often work at the project level or work at the policy level. And then things are implemented. But for example, at the policy level, you can make sure that a certain amount of new houses built go to female-headed households. And so I was looking at the Her Home report by the IFC this morning, and 25% of households in Colombia, for example, are female-headed. That's a quarter of households are led by a woman. In India, it's about 10%. But that number fluctuates from country to country, but it's always a pretty big number. And you can make sure that if there is a government housing project, that you reserve a certain amount of housing units for female-headed households. Another thing that you can do is you can incorporate within banking guidelines preferential guidelines for female-headed households. You can ensure that they get preferential guidelines so they don't get discriminated credit-wise. You can also say if there is a married couple applying for a loan, and this happens very often. Often the married couple applies for the loan, but only the man is on the title of the home, even though they both owe the debt.
They both owe the
Yes.
debt, or she might have contributed to the financing or the collateral for the loan.
So you can ensure that they are both, if you are both responsible for the loan, then you both must be on the title, ensuring equal access for women. So at a policy level, there's a lot you can do to involve women. And then when you design the projects themselves, I think it's so important to listen to women more often. And even in I live in Boston, and I have two small toddlers, and it's a very dangerous environment to have two small toddlers. And Boston is considered one of the most walkable cities in the US. And yet I am in a constant fear of cars hitting my children. And this is a worldwide fear, right? Because cities were designed around cars. They were not designed around women and their needs and children. So even in my city in Boston, I tried to advocate for longer cross times for the sidewalks, right? For the crosswalks, right? Because they tried bringing two small toddlers in
across the street in 25 seconds.
Yes.
Right.
They give you no time, and then the cars get a whole minute, but you get 5 seconds. Even in the US, there's a lot more we can do plowing the sidewalks in my city. They don't plow the sidewalks, they plow the roads professionally, and so the cars get access to the roads. But if you are pushing a stroller in your community and it has just snowed, it is very, very difficult. So that's just some of the things that I'm doing for myself. But when you think about women in other countries, all their needs from, if they are the homemaker, let's help them make this process easier and better, giving access to community gardens, implementing daycares within the communities, having safe roads with no cars, having play spaces, green spaces, places where people can cook communally, all types of different options. And again, it's not for me to pick them. It's to give a voice to the community for them to say what they need themselves.
I think all of those are wonderful examples. And I'm glad that you brought up Boston because I was going to say any or all of these could also be transferable to the United States or other G8 countries. But I think the difference is that we have the capacity in terms of financial and technical resources. It's about being willing to make the mental shift, if that's a fair way of saying it.
Yeah, and empowering people to speak their mind and to show that their voice is just as important.
You are now, you've worked in a number of different countries, but a number of different kinds of institutions. And sometimes when you're within an institution or a large organization, being able to filter the agency and the desires of people in communities on the ground up to the policy level can be difficult. So I'm interested in how you are designing or co-designing the solutions, the concepts, the feedback that would eventually become policy for your organization to make sure that those voices are surfaced.
I think it's about working both ways. So I love what I do, and I really focus on a unique niche, and not many people do what I do. And so I've been really focusing on housing development. And so I've seen a lot of what can work and what can't work. And so, for example, right now, I'm working in Mongolia. And okay. Mongolia is a very interesting, the capital of Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar, is actually the most polluted city in the world in the winter. And children suffer considerably. They have a lot of respiratory diseases because of it. And one of the reasons is because they heat their homes with coal. It's very, very cold, and they heat their homes with coal, and the homes are poorly insulated. And the children are just living amongst coal burning, all winter long. So, we're trying to figure out how, and the government has done a lot of great work on housing, but it's only accessible to the top 10% of the population. They've built these really energy efficient green homes, but it's really not working for 90% of the population. So what we're trying to do, and we're inspired by what has worked in other countries, and what we see in Mongolia is that it's one of the least dense places in the world as well, because of land allocation that was done over the last few decades. You see, it kind of almost looks like Texas in terms of density.
And how people are spread out.
Yeah. Right. And exactly. And so now, being inspired by the ADU movement in the US, or what's being called backyarding in South Africa, this idea of applying a gentle density from our countries to this country, so another context. But so building additional units in people's backyards, but making them green, making them earthquake resistant, because they have very strong earthquakes in Mongolia too, making them resistant to the cold and everything. So we come in with an idea that was inspired by somewhere else. We tweak it, we modify it. But then it's so important to go back to the community level and to say, and so we're going back in a month to present our various plans. And we're sitting down with the communities and saying, well, what do you think about this? Because we're foreigners, we don't know. We think this might work. We've worked very hard on this, but it's really up to you. And there's no point designing something that nobody will implement at the end of the day. And so this is where we really come in and collect the feedback and retweak our ideas and make sure it's well cooked. Then once we're happy, when everybody's happy, then we can go back to the banks and the policymakers and ministers and the World Bank to make sure that the policy is well formulated. But yeah, I'd say there's a community level up thing, but there's also inspiration for what has worked around the world.
Right. And what can be translational. And so there is a balance between the uniqueness of different communities and also models and ideas that can translate from one environment to the other. Because like you mentioned, in terms of density, Mongolia and Texas, it kind of looks like Texas, but Texas has very serious issues with dirty energy and the need to rethink housing and zoning and a number of different things if the state is to actually, continue to be a viable place to live over the coming decades, right? So it definitely makes sense for things that can reverberate from one location to the next to have a place of comparison. I want to talk a little bit more about difficult context because in your origin story, you talked about Haiti. And in my work, that is one of the touch points that I look to for inspiration and to be motivated for self correction in how I approach work and how I think about engaging with communities and understanding, the reasons why some places are the way we describe them is difficult in some way, shape, or form. What would be your perspective on how we use whatever comes next in some of these countries after they've gone through periods of conflict or after a post disaster context about how you begin to generate ideas and move forward, particularly around housing, because that's one of the first things that you want to do when you want to stabilize communities is rehouse people and bring those basic needs back into contour. So I'm just curious, when you're thinking about evolving from difficult contexts and using opportunities to make them green spaces, what are some of the things you think through? What are some of your initial approaches to that?
That's a great question. Actually, I'll give you an example. I'm working in Timor-Leste, and it's a country next to Indonesia that was formed about 2 decades ago after a long war with Indonesia, and
Yeah.
it has quite a traumatic past to it, but it had this opportunity to kind of start fresh, right? And it's a new country. It has very little um, infrastructure that it's built on. And a lot of these countries that I go to, whether it's Haiti or Senegal or and you name it, it's so many countries have a legacy of colonial infrastructure and post-colonial infrastructure and bureaucracies. And you try to make changes, and it's very difficult because there's just the laws don't or enable easy change, right? And there's a lot of hurdles. But in Timor-Leste, we had the opportunity to kind of start from scratch. And to give you an example, they didn't even have a land title registry when I started working there, which was 2 years ago.
Wow.
So we were going to do a big housing project, but then we figured out, they don't have a land title registry. Okay, so first things first, let's build a land title registry because that's kind of the first thing you need. And then they have the opportunity to leapfrog all the mess of the past few hundred years. You go to the land title registry in Haiti and it's a mess. I mean, it's piles of paper. They're disintegrating. It's not organized. And that's why urban development is so difficult also in Haiti, because it's just really difficult to know who owns which piece of land. And now you have the opportunity to make everything digital. You have the opportunity to put everything on the blockchain and make sure that you can track all land transactions over time. And so, my hope for Haiti, once it comes out of the current crisis it's in, is that it can kind of start fresh and really with a clean slate and say, okay, let's put the past to the past and just maybe recreate some of this infrastructure, take the best from the world and put behind them the past, because it just was incredibly difficult working within that framework over the past 20 years.
Yeah, I think that's both a beautiful and a very practical thought at the same time. I would just say, in terms of laws not functioning, being a native Louisianian who also worked in Haiti, we're the only two places on the planet that still use parts of the Code Napoleon as active law.
I did not know about Louisiana, but okay. Yeah.
Yes. Um, in terms of property rights and part of our criminal code. So allow that to be appropriately terrifying that we're using concepts from 18th century colonial ideas and trying to put them in context. And so, having been through that, I greatly empathize. But, for our listeners, just understanding just how important the law and the policy are in places, because people act like, well, why can't you just take everything down and start again? It's, well, you have to know who it belongs to,
That's right.
where
Yeah.
things should be.
Yeah, and I think that was the biggest hurdle after the earthquake. Billions of dollars poured into the country, but very little was rebuilt in terms of housing. And it was because every time a piece of land was found, and it was almost impossible to be completely sure about land ownership. And I'll give you an example. My company wanted to rebuild houses for its employees, so we bought a piece of land and we built about 25 houses on it. And then within a year of finishing them, they were claimed by another individual, and we and this is a common story that so many people experience. And so then the reconstruction of the city didn't take place at a large scale pace. It had to take place at an individual, each person doing their own thing, since huge swaths of land could not be used to do anything. And that's a lot more inefficient.
Right. I was going to say the story of a piece of land is purchased, it's developed, the titling isn't exact, and then you find that the person has been evicted by someone else who thinks they have stronger title, or someone from the diaspora, and perhaps it was a landlord tenant situation. Like, the list goes on and on about unstable land tenure in these places. And how do we even begin to think about urban planning or even rural planning for housing when you can't get that piece of it clarified? And so I hope the audience takes a little bit from that when you're looking at these things from an outsider's point of view.
But Rwanda gave us an incredible example of how it can be done, right? So after the genocide, they said, okay, enough is enough. We need to start from fresh. And they gave every single person, I think in the capital, I'm not sure about the country, but in the capital, an address. So even if you live in the slum, you now have an address. Because many people in the world don't have an address. So they now have an address, and they have land ownership, even if it's just their little hut. And so they went through a huge process, and it was time consuming. It took a lot of resources, but they gave each habitant land ownership, including a lot of women, of their homes. And now, because people own their homes, even if it's just a shack, they will invest in it. They will take out a loan and they will invest in it because they know they will not be kicked out, right? And so they will make it stronger. They will make it more resilient to climate change. They will make it greener. They will take a lot more ownership of their home and make it into something better. But when you live in uncertainty, when you're not sure who your home belongs to, if the government will step in and take it tomorrow, if you're going to be evicted, you're not going to take out a loan and put in money in making it a better place. And you're not going to invest in your neighborhood either. Why make your neighborhood better when it's just a temporary thing?
That resonates in a number of different ways. I was going to ask you, differences in resources and potential for political engagement vary across countries, but we're facing some of these same issues in the United States. Are there success stories that you've seen coming from communities that you've worked in other countries that you think could or should be translational to some of the work we ought to be doing here?
So I was actually thinking about that the other day, because the truth is I'm working on a housing program in Indonesia to build 1 million green homes a year, right? I'm working in the Philippines on something similar, big numbers. But then when it comes to my community in the US, and I advocate for 24 affordable housing units in my neighborhood, I'm terrified. Yeah. The people here are very scary.
Yes, they are.
They're very scary. And it's very funny because I was very intimidated. And whereas when I travel around the world and work on these problems, I people welcome me most often, and they want to see housing built in their communities, and they want to see improvements, and this idea of NIMBYism. I mean, I'm sure it exists, but I just haven't encountered it that much. And then just working on little small scale improvements here and there, adding a bike lane is such a headache in the US. It's such a it becomes political,
in very weird ways at times.
It is, yeah. So, and adding affordable housing is political. And I live in a beautiful neighborhood outside of Boston, and a lot of it is considered historical preservation, which I
Hmm.
more or less understand. But I'm sorry, but the TJ Maxx parking lot is not a historical parking lot.
No.
It's at the end of my street. I avoid it because I think it's really ugly. It's just an above ground parking lot, and I'm in one of the most expensive cities in the US. And yet, when you advocate to build more units, there's you can sense a reactionary fear, right? That many people, and I think it's this fear that people are going to lose value in their homes. I hope it's that fear and not other fears. But and that's proven again and again and again not to be true, right? Adding more housing units anyway in the short term doesn't decrease the value of your property. It doesn't decrease the value of your rent. It can only do good in the long term too. So yes, I think we can and we should inspire ourselves from international examples, and really we have so much more to do at home, and I need to overcome this fear and use the
Oh,
strength from abroad to kind of work within my own community.
the fear of our neighbors. It is challenging because bike lanes do become political. I am fearful that, as we're speaking, to the audience at the time that we're recording this, this is a couple of days after the major bridge collapse in the city of Baltimore. And the social media and even some of the traditional media messaging around blaming the bridge collapse on a variety of people and making it political has been shocking. And it doesn't even allow for a discussion of, well, let's, once, we've acknowledged the people who lost their lives and take care of their families, let's acknowledge that that bridge was over the Chesapeake Bay, one of the most important ecosystems on the East Coast, in a city that struggles with all kinds of environmental issues. It doesn't leave opportunity to have the conversation about, well, you know what, when we build that back, maybe there's some other things we could be thinking about for the river, for the neighborhoods around it, all of those things. Like, you can't even enter that conversation when all of these weird political battles are going on about a bridge
Yes,
at the end
right.
of the
Yeah, the politics are very scary, and I'd like to stay away from them as much as possible. But the example that is inspiring to me is my home city of Paris, which went through an incredible transformation over the past decade, where they shut down major highways, right, and
Yep.
turned them into recreational spaces where kids can bike, can have fun. There's more cafes outdoors. There's pubs. And they're bringing nature back into the city too. The street I went to school on is now close to cars and has trees and parks, and it's just lovely. And of course, at first there was a huge backlash, and there still is a bit of a backlash. People were just, how am I going to drive through the city? People think about their individual needs, and their, it becomes political. It becomes conspiracy theories come out about, I'm sure you've seen some of them about the 15-minute city, about control, and they're quite funny sometimes. But I think at the end of the day, once people experience it, everybody is better off.
Yeah.
Everybody feels better off when they feel safe, when they feel contact with nature, when you have access to for example, in Boston, we have a beautiful river, the Charles River, and it has a highway on both sides of it.
Yeah.
I think everybody would be better off if we had at least one side without a highway and with some nice beaches and recreational areas. And that doesn't have to be political at all. It's just about the well-being of mankind and nature. So hopefully we can try just kind of having maybe these like pilot projects and have people come and experience them. Like there's a new one in Boston I really love, and they opened a pub by the river. And I think everybody likes a good
Oh,
pub, by the river. It's
what
great.
fun.
Yes.
Yeah.
And doing more of that. Everybody likes it when you close down the streets and you have cafes and you have, everybody likes a good night out, and that it doesn't have to be political. So maybe it won't be a sweeping change overnight, but showing people slowly but surely how much fun it can be to have a carbon maybe not free yet, but a carbon reduced city anyway, bringing nature back into the city, walking places. Such a pleasure. And yes, removing it completely from politics if possible.
Absolutely. I think that's a great reason for anyone who's listening who can should go and visit Paris. That's also one of my favorite places.
I heard a funny thing the other day. Americans spend thousands and thousands of dollars to honeymoon or to go on vacation in Europe. But then they oppose any laws that would make their cities more European, right? And it's
Yeah, it's a strange thing. And then also, whenever you see lists of America's favorite small towns or America's favorite main street, they're actually the 15-minute cities of which people speak. I live in one of them in Alexandria, Virginia. And so we have parks along the Potomac River, and sections of the city are pedestrian promenades with cafes where car lanes used to be. Now there's tables where people can sit and eat, and you can walk to healthcare, grocery store, school all within 15 minutes. And it is one of America's favorite main street. I can't even remember how many times, but when someone uses the language, 15-minute cities, the internet goes up in flames. I was like, but you actually love it.
yeah.
You actually vote for it without question. Um,
And you spend
but
money to go to places like that. Yeah, that's an interesting point. So maybe it is a question of language. Maybe we need to change our language to depoliticize it, and to keep it neutral. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the solution is. But if the 15-minute city has become something political, let's use a different thing. I don't know.
I don't know either. Maybe what I'll do is interview an anthropologist or an ethnologist to help us kind of unpack why this language triggers some people, or it triggers images of something that's more harmful in some people's minds than those of us who've experienced it. Or maybe it's what you're saying is once people can experience it and actually know what it is, then they won't be so frightened by it. One last, let's hope. Last question that I ask everyone who's participated in this season is, it's wonderful to surface the stories of women who are doing the work, but also I want to encourage other women to enter these spaces and join and contribute and seek out careers and opportunities. And I love to hear what you would tell a person who's coming behind you that wants to get into this work of making sure that people are housed and that women's voices and communities' voices are surfaced. What would you say to them about how to get into this space, why to get into this space?
I think the why is clear. The why is we need you. The cities need you. Our future generations need you. I think women think further into the future than men. And we plan our cities to reflect the future we want for our children, our grandchildren, etc. Right? The how is much harder. And having worked on construction sites in Haiti after an earthquake when I was 24 years old, yeah, it takes some grit, some resilience. It's hard, but it's also just so rewarding, right? It's really rewarding in a different way. Yes, the world is dangerous, but it's also incredibly safe too. I've traveled around the world. I've worked in many places as a woman, and I've encountered a lot of strange things, but also a lot of really kind, nice people who are willing to help you. And so I guess my message is there's a lot of fear out there, right? There's a lot of like all the stuff that can happen to you working as a woman in construction or in developing countries or in male oriented industries. But that's just a small piece of the puzzle, right? And there's a lot more of us than there were before, and I think the world is changing every day. And what you get out of it can be so motivating. And so that feeling of handing over the keys of the first house I built to a family. Oh my God, and I can't build an IKEA table, but I managed to bring this big construction site. And that feeling is just so rewarding in so many ways. And being able to shape that future, it's very gratifying in a way that many industries I think are not, because it's so tangible. We're basically building the cities around us, and we can shape them in the ways that we think are best.
I love that. Thank you so much for that answer, for your time. And For those who would like to follow your work, where should they go?
I guess follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I'm always posting about the work I do and other people's work that I find very interesting.
LinkedIn or Twitter.
Yeah.
And I love that you still call it Twitter. Like none of us are adopting to that X business.
Yeah, I feel like very few people have, but yes.
Awkward. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And to my listeners, keep following this season. We have spoken to Black women farmers, blockchain advocates. We've talked to Gen Z environmental activists, and we're not even close to being done talking through all of the remarkable women who are out in this world making it inch a little bit closer to being better every single day. You can follow the podcast and all of our work at Undivide Project on all channels, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.